Hello. So in this video we're going to talk about Yvette Nolan's play Job's Wife or the Delivery of Grace. Now, Yvette Nolan is one of my favorite playwrights. I've done videos on her plays Annie Mae's Movement and The Birds, and this is another absolutely fantastic play. So it's a fairly quick play. Basically, in this play, there's a woman named Grace who has gotten pregnant with the child of her lover, Paul. Paul is an Indigenous Canadian, First Nations Canadian. Grace is white. They are unmarried. Paul is not real keen on the idea of having a child. Grace's parents are not real keen on the idea of her having a child, particularly when she's not married, and particularly with an Indigenous person. So, and Grace herself seems to be on the fence about whether or not she actually wants this baby. So, the play opens with her praying, and we have the baby spirit in the background. So this is the unborn child, the spirit of the unborn child, who's in the background throughout the play. And it periodically makes noise, or it'll sort of echo things that other characters have said, often in ways that are deeply symbolic, challenging the story that Grace is telling, or whatever it is. So Grace is praying, and we get a mix. This section I'm gonna read you has a mix of stage directions and dialogue from Grace. So when I'm reading I've used this system before. When I'm reading stage directions, I'll hold up one finger. When I'm reading dialogue, no fingers. So it says, Grace continues to tell her rosary. Her lips move. She becomes more distressed the more beads she tells. The light warms on the white god on the scaffolding upstage right. He holds a white neutral mask before his face. He appears to be watching Grace, or perhaps not. Oh, please, where are you? Why can't I find you now? The white god turns his face away from Grace as his light fades. Please, are you there? It's me. She listens, senses nothing, bows her head, whispering, Now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep. Lights fade on Grace. In the darkness there is noise from slightly up and above, the sound of bones against bones and a rattle that sounds like a snake. The lights come up upstage on the scaffold. The figure is laid out flat on top of the scaffold. He wears a cape that is made of rags and bones. As he rises up, the cape makes a rattling sound. He sits on the edge of the scaffold and watches the sleeping Grace for a moment. He is a big man, obviously native Indian. He points a finger at a light, gunshot style, and a light pops on to illuminate the sleeping Grace. She moans a little, stirs, falls silent again. And so then this figure, which in the cast list and the script itself is marked him, but he tells Grace to call him Josh. This figure wakes Grace up and reveals that he is God. And Grace is not entirely on board with this idea. So a little ways in, she says, All right, Josh, if I did indeed call you, I mean, no offense, but I'm a Catholic born and bred, and you'll excuse my saying it, you're not exactly my idea of God. He says, Aren't I? She says, Perhaps you have the wrong room. Paul's asleep in the other room. You'd probably measure up to his idea of a god. He says, Because he's native, you mean? She says, Yes. Pause. How did you know that? He gives her a now Grace look. He gives her a now Grace look. Of course, you know everything. Perhaps you really want Paul. He says, no, Grace, I'm for you. Paul doesn't ask for things. He just gives thanks frequently. Grace says he does. He says, speaking of which, have you got a little tobacco, a cigarette, pipe? No? Sighs. But your prayers are full of need, so tell me what you need. And so this is one interesting component of the dynamic between Grace and Josh. I'm going to call him Josh, even though, again, the script says him. This continual sort of doubt on her part, and he gives us these interesting commentaries about religious tradition, particularly Catholic traditions. So, for instance, he questions the logic of confession, where rather than going to the person that you've wronged and trying to make amends, you go to a priest who, in principle, doesn't know who you are, because confession is, I believe, supposed to be anonymous, and that priest gives you forgiveness. So this is one of the things that Josh sort of challenges her on, when Grace makes the argument that because she's gone to confession and received absolution, she's no longer guilty. Along those same lines, actually, Josh transforms himself into the priest and plays out her confession. And this is another thing that Josh does repeatedly. He transforms himself into different figures to help Grace, maybe to help Grace work through this. So at one point he becomes her father, who basically tells her that her mom is not going to be okay with her being an unwed mother, particularly an unwed mother where the father is a First Nations man. Josh transforms into Paul, Grace's lover, and they have several conversations, largely about whether or not he wants the baby and whether or not she wants the baby. So what we're getting throughout the play is this sort of exploration of Grace's process of coming to terms with the situation that she's in, of being pregnant, and actually having kind of chosen to get pregnant in an attempt to get Paul, to sort of bind Paul to her, without Paul's knowledge. So he didn't know. And when he initially asked, she had lied about it and said that she didn't intend to get pregnant. So all of these sort of dynamics are played out. This ambivalence that Grace has about the baby, about her various relationships with her parents, with Paul, with God. All of these things are sort of explored, and over the course of the play, Grace finds out from God, from Josh, that she's going to miscarry. And she asks God for a miracle, basically. She asks God to save her baby. And he is ambivalent about that, in part because of her ambivalence about the baby. So it's an interesting play, an interesting dynamic. But then, as is so often the case, I've been going through this collection, Staging Coyote's Dream, edited by Monique Mojica and Rick Knowles. And one of the things that I'm consistently seeing in these plays, we see it in Almighty Voice and His Wife, we see it in Princess Pocahontas and the Blue Spots. So the very end of the play is deeply resonant and deeply important. So At the end of the play, Grace is losing the baby. She's starting her miscarriage. And Paul is going to go get the car to take her to the hospital. And she says, "Paul, can I have a cigarette?" Paul says, "Yeah, sure, I guess so." He pulls out the cigarette package, gives her a cigarette, and offers her the lighter. Grace says, "No, just the cigarette, thanks." He leaves. Grace puts the cigarette on the floor, looks at it, undecided, picks it up, tears the paper off, piles the tobacco neatly, surveys this, stands, looks at the tobacco again, shrugs, exits. So, again, we have another sort of great performative ending to a play that really changes the dynamic of the show as a whole. Because here she is leaving a kind of offering, leaving a gift, maybe a sacrifice for Josh, who had, as we saw earlier in the play, asked if she had any tobacco or cigarettes, a pipe, anything like that. And actually, when he puts on the cardigan to play her father, he finds her father's pipe and he gets very excited, but then he can't find any tobacco for it. So Grace, who throughout the play has doubted Josh being God, has been very resistant to this idea. At the end, Grace sort of recognizes and accepts Josh's divinity, his spiritual authority, whatever it is. She comes to terms with this situation.